Novosafo in for David Brancaccio. A lot of investors are betting that the Federal Reserve did not really mean it when it predicted last week that we're likely to get just one interest rate cut this year. With inflation looking like it's cooling again, many on Wall Street are thinking two cuts, the first as early as September. Meanwhile, no less than 7 Fed officials are scheduled to make public comments this week. And here with some insight into what she'll be listening for is Julia Coronado, founder and president of Macro Policy Perspectives. Good morning, Julia.
Good morning.
So we got a bit of a preview over the weekend. Minneapolis Fed President Neel Kashkari predicting just one rate cut in December. Really, we swear. Are you buying that?
The question is, these officials got some really important data on the same day as their meeting. Had they internalized it when they wrote down one cut or two cuts, or as they see that data and work through it and look at the details, will they actually believe it more and lean more towards two cuts, which is what the market is leaning towards right now?
And by important data, you mean the latest consumer price index report on inflation?
Yes, exactly, which showed a broad-based cooling, more than expected. And I suspect that if we get another one or two of reports like that, they might be in the mood to start adjusting policy a little bit earlier than what they wrote down last week.
And what about tomorrow's retail sales data for May? Could that help settle this question of one cut or more?
Not necessarily. All eyes are on the inflation data to see whether that cooling continues.
Julia Coronado, founder and president of Macro Policy Perspectives. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
And one of the biggest private bus operators in the U.S. has filed for bankruptcy. Coach USA runs a network of commuter services, mostly in the Northeast, as well as megabus service throughout the country. It saw ridership fall during the pandemic and failed to recover. Marketplace's Megan McCarty-Carino has more.
While airlines and cruises are again seeing record bookings, bus trips have continued to lag, says Peter Pantuso, CEO of the American Bus Association.
We lost somewhere between 40 and 50% of the industry.
The biggest hit has been to commuter services, he says, typically between outer suburbs and city centers.
People stopped going to work 5 days a week all of a sudden, and now they're going maybe one day a week if they're going in at all.
Longer trips, like those from Megabus, have fared a little better, says Joe Schwieterman, a transportation professor at DePaul University. But domestic airfares are still relatively cheap, and the motor coach industry has struggled with driver shortages, rising labor, and fuel costs.
People are like super price sensitive, so they'll take the bus, but don't make the fare the same price as Amtrak, or they're going to ditch you for the train.
One bright spot in the industry, he says, is charter bus service. With spending on other forms of travel and leisure up, there's more demand for tours and connections. I'm Megan McCarty-Carino for Marketplace.
Let's do the numbers. In pre-market trading on Wall Street, Dow futures are down by 0.25% or about 100 points. S&P futures are down 0.1%, and the Nasdaq is pointing up almost 0.1%.
Marketplace Morning Report is supported by Progressive Insurance, providing direct car insurance rates side by side with other insurance carriers. Customers can see rates and find an option that works for their needs. Now that's Progressive. Learn more at progressive.com. And by Affinity, provider of the CRM for the private capital relationship economy. Affinity knows who has the best relationship with the right startup. Affinity.co/marketplace.
In Baltimore, there's just 1 week left for construction companies to get their bids in for rebuilding the bridge that spans over the waterway leading into the city's port. The Francis Scott Key Bridge collapsed in March after a massive barge crashed into it. As Marketplace's Nancy Marshall-Genzer reports, many Baltimore area companies are hoping to play a role in the reconstruction.
At the entrance to the now deserted road leading to the Key Bridge, there's a roadside memorial to the 6 construction workers who perished when the bridge collapsed. Janet Gronke stands in front of 6 giant crosses, each topped by a hard hat and draped with pictures, flowers, and steel-toed boots.
I mean, it's so touching to me.
Gronke is CEO of Sunrise Safety Services, which does traffic control at highway construction sites and makes street signs. Everybody knows everybody in the Baltimore area's road construction community. Gronke didn't know the crew that died, but their company was one of her regular customers. She knows people there and grieved with them.
It's a good way to honor them.
Back in her office, Gronke and her daughter Tiffany Schrouder, who also works at Sunrise, reconstruct the day Key Bridge fell. Gronke drove over the bridge at the end of the day on March 25th, just hours before the collapse.
God said, here you go. You can go over one more time, Jen.
The next morning, Gronke got a call from Tiffany. The bridge was down. Tiffany was also on the phone with the company in charge of shutting off traffic to the bridge. They needed signs, barriers, and electronic billboards immediately.
If we didn't have it in stock to make it new, and we had it out in the rack already used, we grabbed it just to get them out there to get the job done.
Janet Gronke says it ended up being a pretty big job for Sunrise, several $100,000. She'd like to be part of the reconstruction work, even though it looks like the new bridge will only need 20 to 30 signs. A big job would involve closer to 100.
Even if it's not a huge job, it would be an honor to be a part of it.
Gronke won't be part of the initial phase of the bridge reconstruction. Huge national and international firms will bid on that, then subcontract work to smaller firms like Sunrise. John Crocker teaches at the University of Maryland's Business School. He figures at least a quarter of the bridge work will be done by Baltimore area firms.
Just because they're here and available to do the work, and it would be more efficient to hire them.
Crocker says the Maryland Transportation Authority, which is in charge of the project, is requiring that 26% of the work be done by what it calls disadvantaged firms, including women and minority-owned companies. Crocker says they're typically local. I'm Nancy Marshall-Genzer for Marketplace.
And I'm Nova Sapo with a Marketplace Morning Report. From APM, American Public Media.
WNYC supporters include Earth Justice, a national legal nonprofit fighting for a healthy environment for all. More at earthjustice.org. Earth Justice, because the earth needs a good lawyer.
Up next, the BBC NewsHour on WNYC. Today on All of It, a look at the science behind teenage emotions in the new Pixar film Inside Out 2 with psychologist Lisa D'Amour. Plus, playwright and actor Maya Novi opens up about her personal journey with mental health, which inspired her play Invasive Species. That's at 10 this morning. 71, actually at noon today. 71 and partly sunny, now sunshine, mid-80s today. It's WNYC in New York.
This is WNYC, FM, HD, and AM, New York.
Welcome to NewsHour. It's live from the BBC World Service in London. I'm Tim Franks. France begins its snap election campaign with a warning from its most famous footballer that the extremes are knocking at the doors of power. Also, the BBC hears testimony that the Greek Coast Guard caused the deaths of migrants in the Mediterranean.
They started with the Cameroonian. They threw him in the water. The Ivorian said, "Save me, I don't want to die."
The Israeli Prime Minister gets rid of his war cabinet. The hunt to conscript Ukrainian men of war-fighting age.
These men who are hiding, I don't consider them men. What are they waiting for? If we run out of men, the enemy will come to their homes, they will rape their women and kill their children.
And the music stars with a difference. K-pop's first hearing-impaired group. All those stories after the news.
This is Danielle Yawowiecka with the BBC News. Hello. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has dissolved his government's war cabinet. The announcement follows the resignation earlier this month of the centrist minister and former General Benny Gantz. Far-right ministers, including Itamar Ben-Gvir, had demanded that they be allowed to take his place. Yolande Nell reports from Jerusalem.
As Israel was reeling from the deadly Hamas-led attacks last October, Benny Gantz joined Mr. Netanyahu in a national unity government and the war cabinet was set up. Since the former general stepped down because of what he said was the lack of strategy for the Gaza war, there have been calls from far-right ministers to take his place. By dissolving the war cabinet, Mr. Netanyahu avoids a tricky situation with his coalition partners and international allies. There have been further signs of strain in the Israeli government in the past day, with hardline ministers denouncing what the military called a tactical pause on a stretch of road near the Kerem Shalom border crossing.
The main UN aid agency in the Gaza Strip says the limited daily pause in activity announced by the Israeli military has yet to make any practical difference. A spokesman for UNRWA told the BBC that law and order conditions had not allowed aid workers to take advantage of the move. Ziad Issa from the charity Action Aid told the BBC that a ceasefire is what is needed.
We talk a lot about aid getting inside Gaza, but the conditions inside the Gaza Strip to deliver this aid is very difficult, mainly because the fighting is happening and the attacks are happening and the security conditions is very low. And this is why a permanent and immediate ceasefire is what we need, and it needs to happen across the entire Gaza Strip and not only around a specific route that aid convoys will use.
Denmark is looking at ways to limit the passage of tankers carrying Russian oil through the Baltic Sea. Russia sends around a third of its seaborne oil exports through the Danish Straits, using a so-called shadow fleet of vessels that conceal their identity to avoid sanctions. Police in Zimbabwe have arrested an opposition leader and dozens of young activists for holding a political meeting. A lawyer said 80 people were arrested with Jameson Timber on Sunday. The law requires that political parties apply for clearance with police beforehand. Shingai Nyoka reports from Harare.
Party youth leaders were holding a meeting to mark the International Day of the African Child when, without warning, police stormed the property, tear-gassed and arrested the group, according to their lawyer agency Gumbo. The property owner, Jameson Timber, a senior figure in the CCC party who was not at the meeting, was arrested separately. While the police said the group did not seek clearance to hold the meeting, Mr. Gumbo told the BBC that this was an internal private meeting rather than a public gathering and as such did not require clearance. The group is expected to appear in court on Tuesday.
World News from the BBC.
On WNYC, 71 and partly sunny at 9:04. Good morning, I'm Michael Hill. It's a dreaded rite of spring for tenants in about 1 million New York City apartments. A board of mayoral appointees is set to decide this evening how much more they'll pay in rent next year. WNYC's David Brand reports on the upcoming Rent Guidelines Board vote.
The RGB is considering a rent increase between 2 and 4.5% on new one-year leases, and up to 6.5% on two-year leases for tenants in stabilized apartments. Tenant groups and many elected officials are urging the board to freeze the rent instead, but landlords are demanding an even higher rent hike. They say their own costs are rising. The RGB decided to raise rents by 3% last year.
Governor Hochul and state lawmakers are facing pressure to fill a big gap in the MTA's budget caused by the governor's indefinite pause on congestion pricing. For years, left-leaning organizations have been pushing to tax the wealthy to pay for transit upgrades, but they're hesitant to call for that now because they don't want to wave the white flag on congestion pricing. Jasmine Gripper co-directs the Working Families Party. She says a tax on the wealthy should be Plan B.
If we can't bypass the governor's pause, then the legislature absolutely should explore taxing the ultra-wealthy as a way of filling the gaps for the MTA.
Hochul might call lawmakers back to Albany next month to find a funding source for transit projects. Southbound 4 trains are running on the express track from Burnside Avenue to 167th Street. The LIRR's Ronkonkoma branch is temporarily suspended both ways east of Farmingdale. A crash on the northbound Cross Island Parkway at Hillside Avenue, blocking one lane. Alternate side parking rules suspended in the city, but still paid the parking meters. 71 and partly sunny now, mostly sunny, 85 today, but a heat wave is on the way.
Hello and welcome to NewsHour. It's live from the BBC World Service studios in London. I'm Tim Franks. And it is kick-off today for France in 2 competitions. This evening, local time, will be the national football team's opening group game in the Euros, one of the great sports tournaments. And that's been prefaced earlier today by the start of the incredibly compressed campaign for parliamentary elections. The snap vote that the President, Emmanuel Macron, called after his governing party was hammered in the elections to the European Parliament. Me talking about both the Euros and the elections is not entirely gratuitous, because some of France's biggest football stars have used news conferences at the tournament to warn that what's riding on this vote is unprecedented. As Kylian Mbappe put it, we see the extremes are knocking on the door of power. And the massive gamble for the centrist president is that leading the opinion polls is the far-right National Rally and its allies, and second in the opinion polls is a coalition that includes some far-left parties. Nicolas Conquet is a first-time candidate for the National Rally in Normandy in northwest France. Nicolas, very good to have you here on NewsHour. It's a bit embarrassing, isn't it, to have the French national football team saying that they want people to turn out to vote in order to thwart the extremes.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Of course, it doesn't feel right for sports from the national sports team to be giving directions to whether what people should vote or not vote for. As they're wearing the national jersey, they should be respecting everybody's voice and not jumping into the political arena.
Yeah, but I mean, I suppose the point is that they are very prominent representations of a multicultural, multi-ethnic France that your party stands against.
Well, it's also, these people are part of a very favored, very wealthy, super wealthy elite, non-paying taxes, living far away from home. Maybe they're not really disconnected with what's really happening on a day-to-day basis for all French citizens, whatever their origin, religion, or cultural background, and therefore they may not be fully connected to people's voter issues.
Well, you talk about voter issues, and I mean, as far as I'm aware, you haven't actually publicised yet your precise manifesto for government, but from some of the promises that you made ahead of the European elections, it seems that you've got a very broad ambition to make all sorts of changes in terms of slashing people's electricity and energy bills, reducing the retirement age, massively increasing public spending. I mean, lots of populist ideas, but it's completely unaffordable, isn't it?
So what was happening today is that we're creating a rally of all the different families of the right, and that's to this day unachieved in France. So that's one of the great successes. We're going to be reunited on what unites us rather than what shows our differences. So let's unite and win. And regarding the positions, of course, there's major issues regarding cost of livings on which we'll be very strong on, as well as reestablishing law and order and ensuring that the immigration is under control, because it's totally been fully not strict, and the threat of having the left, far left, take over is really dramatic, as they're going to go for massive amnesties.
Okay, well, we'll come on to immigration in a moment, but I mean, you know, these plans to cut power bills, to cut VAT, the sort of surtax on electricity, gas and heating oil, that you want to return the retirement age from 64 to 62, offer a zero-interest €100,000 loan to boost home ownership, axe inheritance tax. I mean, you say that these are all things that you would like to achieve, and we've already seen, with you leading in the opinion polls, the stock market fall, the cost of borrowing go up. It's because your plans are uncosted and unrealistic, aren't they?
They're coming with savings that are going to be made. There's a massive issue, which we're hoping that you would point it out, is that under Emmanuel Macron, it's been 1,300 billion euros increased debt that we've experienced over the last 7 years. It's now time for it to come to an end. We're going to be suggesting urgently that we audit all the budgets and that we identify where we can do cuts. Specific organizations and agencies have been identified in that matter to save massive costs, and that's going to be financing all these measures that are going to be taken. Some of the costs, some of the measures regarding electricity, which is massive, is clearly fully opacity on how it's been calculated, and therefore there needs to be some changes brought to that.
Okay, right. I mean, all parties say that they want to cut down on waste. It doesn't necessarily mean that you end up with the sort of money that you are promising. When it comes to migration, you talked about that, and obviously the National Rally, they want to reduce the levels of illegal and also significantly legal migration. Just to be clear, are you talking about reimposing border security, closing France's borders, despite the fact that in the European Union you're supposed to have open borders?
Well, the first thing as a sovereign nation is abiding under the rule of law, and the first law that we need to ensure is having secure borders and ensuring that you know who's coming in and out of your territory. Given all the terrorist threat that we're facing, it seems like a massive responsibility, and that's what the national French voters will be voting us into parliament for. So there's a clear responsibility to secure our borders and ensure that we're limiting all this migrations, as well as it's been imposed previously onto the French population that has never consented on it. They're being shipped into the all different small towns within France. Okay. And that's why that we'll be consulting, giving through referendums to understand whether or not the people are in favor for such decisions.
Nicolas Conquet for the National Rally, thank you very much for joining us. Well, Charlotte Minviel is the candidate for the left-wing New Popular Front. It's the anti-National Rally coalition that's been set up comprising a number of parties. She is in the constituency representing the French people living abroad in Northern Europe. Charlotte, thank you for joining us on NewsHour.
Thank you very much.
One of the criticisms that's been levelled against the New Popular Front is that actually your economic programme, is rather similar actually to the National Rally's in terms of its populism, in terms of the things like wanting to lower the pension age, capping energy prices and so forth. And it's the same criticism, which is that the markets have already said it's completely unaffordable.
Well, our program is actually fully costed. It's actually been verified by economists. It's very thorough, and actually, it's going to bring additional revenue. And I think what has brought instability actually on our economic situation is the fact of calling these snap elections. I think that's what's worrying the market. We're also seeing how the grade of France has been lowered during Emmanuel Macron's term, and there are great differences, not just on the economic and social policies, of course, between the Rassemblement National and us. Of course, they haven't voted, for example, for increasing the minimum age. They haven't the minimum wage. They haven't, for example, voted in favor of insulating homes and all of these things in terms of social and environmental priorities. But also, their program is really xenophobic, and they are an absolute threat to our democracy and our society. They have been founded by former SS representatives, and some of them who are still in Parliament. For example, there's an MP currently in Parliament who has been accused of hate crimes, etc. So I think it's a very worrying situation that the president has put us in.
Well, on that point about people with unsavoury backgrounds, what about the man? I realise he's from a different party to you, but he's the leading figure, the figurehead of your coalition, and that's Mr. Mélenchon from the France Insoumise party. Mm-hmm. He is somebody who put up a close ally, formerly convicted of domestic violence, and only after there was a huge outcry said that he was willing to withdraw that person. I mean, Mélenchon is a man who is known as being extremely abrasive and having many enemies. He's not a man who will unite France, is he?
Well, first of all, I mean, I'd like to say that this alliance was put together by leaders of all the different political parties, and Mélenchon is actually not the leader that was part of negotiating at this deal.
But
It
he's
was
the
with leader
figurehead,
of the
isn't he?
Socialist Party. No, he's not actually. And actually, compared to 2022, actually we're not deciding currently who our prime minister would be if we were to govern. And there's a lot of other people on the left, including from the Socialists, from the France Insoumise, other people who would be able to take the lead. And I think what we've gathered around is a program and our policies. And I think that's what's really front and center of what's uniting us, from parties that are more towards the left, from parties like the France Insoumise. I'm actually from the Green Party. And then there's also the Socialists, who are more towards the center or up to the center left. So it's a big coalition. And
it's a big
actually,
coalition, but La France Insoumise is the most powerful of those parties, and Mr. Mélenchon has said that he would be willing to become prime minister. So he is in pole position, and he is a very polarizing figure.
He actually hasn't, he actually hasn't made it a point that he would become prime minister. There's a lot of other figures within different parties. And actually, the leader of the Socialist Party made a great proposition that said, let's see, in terms of which parliamentary group has the most number of MPs, we can decide on a leader who would be more consensual for all of us. So I think we have to put these personalities aside and face the great risk, actually, of the National Front. And we know that Emmanuel Macron's party is now not a solid alternative to that, because they have enabled them to come to this position by putting together an immigration law, which has some very troubling and undignified measures within it. And they've enabled them to be able to be in this position today. And they're the ones confronting us to this risk. So actually, this big coalition on the left is a great source of hope for a lot of people, and we've seen
just Charlotte, in a word, if you would, because we're almost out of time. If it were to come to it that you would have to go into coalition with Mr. Macron's party to thwart the National Rally, would you be willing to do so?
I think, at the moment, this is not the situation that we're hoping for.
No, I understand that. But would you be willing to consider it?
I think at the moment there's a great chance that actually the parties on the left might be in power, and that's what we have to aim for, and that's what I'll put all my efforts to do.
Charlotte, thank you for joining us.
19, and this is WNYC. Today on the Brian Lair Show, Congressmember Jamal Bowman makes his case for re-election to New York's 16th District in Westchester in the Bronx. It's home to one of the most watched Democratic primary races in the country. Plus, City Controller Brad Lander discusses his plans for lawsuit over congestion pricing pause. 72 and partly sunny right now, sunshine mid-80s, and then tomorrow we start a stretch of high temperatures in the 90s. Could be extreme.
Support for WNYC comes from Brooklyn Solar Works, a Brooklyn-based solar design and installation firm bringing clean energy to homes and businesses in New York City. More at brooklynsolarworks.com or 347-377-2705.
With the enhanced WNYC app, you can do it all. Listen to WNYC Radio Live, catch up on podcasts, and read stories from Gothamist and NPR. Download the WNYC app at wnyc.org/app.
This is NewsHour, live from the BBC World Service with me, Tim Franks. Ukraine is facing one of its most perilous moments since the start of the full-scale invasion. Russia, with its vastly greater manpower and war machine, is on the offensive and on the front foot. The Ukrainian army desperately needs to enlist more men if it's to stay in the fight. But more than 2 years into the war, it is struggling to find willing volunteers. The army has now embarked on a new round of mobilisation. Men have until the middle of July to log their details on electronic databases so that they can be called up. This has pushed some of those who don't want to fight into hiding, as our correspondent Jean Mackenzie reports from the southern city of Odessa.
I'm at this beautiful beach club that overlooks the Black Sea on the south coast of Ukraine, and the sun is just about to set. This is where Tanya and Sergei, a young Ukrainian couple, got married just a few weeks ago. But nearly half their guests didn't show up to the wedding because they were too afraid to make the journey here in case they were caught by army officials and forced to enlist. How many people in total didn't come?
Almost 35. It's bad because the moment like wedding, I hope will be once in our life.
But Tanya understands why her friends and family don't want to fight, because her father was killed on the front line and she doesn't want her new husband to be conscripted. You don't want him to go and enlist?
Of course I'm afraid it happened twice in my family. Like my mother, she didn't want that my father do this, and it had a very bad end of this story.
More than 2 years into this war, Ukraine is vastly outnumbered on the battlefield. The army desperately needs more soldiers if it's to stay in this fight. And so now all men between 25 and 60 must register so they can be called up. And because of this, many have gone into hiding.
Сейчас пойдем обратно все. It's my daughter.
My name is Antonina.
7 years.
Vova meets me at the door of his apartment, but we head upstairs quickly.
Now we don't have electricity. It's so horrible.
These days, he only leaves the house with his daughter because he knows he won't get picked up if they're together.
One moment, I can take our dogs.
The Ukrainian army says that it needs people like you to fight if it is to win this war.
Switching
to speak in Russian, Vova tells me he's not a military man. He's never held a weapon. He doesn't think he'd be useful on the front line, and he's certain that's where he'd be sent. Around a dozen soldiers have just descended on the train station in the centre of Odessa. These recruitment officers are stopping men who look as if they're serving age and asking to check their documents. These guys have a pretty fearsome reputation for grabbing people off the streets, of public transport, and taking them straight to enlistment centres. I've come around the corner to the enlistment centre, which is where the men who get their summons have to come, register, and be declared fit to serve. We've just heard there's a threat of a ballistic missile, so we're having to move now to the shelter. Down in the bunker, I meet Vlad, a commander in the Ukrainian army. He's been serving on the front line in the Donbass in the east, but he was badly injured by shrapnel, and so he's working here while he recovers.
These men who are hiding, I don't consider them men. What are they waiting for? If we run out of men, the enemy will come to their homes, they will rape their women and kill their children.
And that was the words of Vlad, a commander in the Ukrainian army, ending that report by Jean Mackenzie. Now, K-pop might seem full of identikit starlets, but Big Ocean are something new. And that's because K-pop, this K-pop group Big Ocean, are composed entirely of hearing-impaired singers. Hyo Jung Kim is a reporter with the BBC Korean service in Seoul, and she's been telling me more.
The Big Ocean consists of 3 members: rapper Chanyeon, main vocalist Hyunjin, and rapper Jisuk. Each member of the group experienced hearing loss at different points in their lives. They were scouted and trained for 2 years by Parastar Entertainment, known for its dedication to artists with disabilities. And I asked why they decided to take this tough path, because becoming idol is very tough here in South Korea. They answered that they wanted to pursue their passion and aspirations.
When I was 3 years old, I had a high fever that affected my hearing.
I was diagnosed with a hearing disability in my 2nd year of high school.
일반인 기준으로 100%라고 하면 저는 보청기의 도움을 받아서
If we assume that full hearing is 100%,
I can hear about 60 to 70% with the help of a hearing aid.
보청기를 착용하고 있고요. N95를 착용하고 있습니다. 왼쪽은 아예 안 들린다고 생각.
I wear a hearing aid and I also use a cochlear implant. I can't hear anything with my left ear. And my right ear only has a little hearing left.
엄마가 아무래도 충격이 많으셨어요.
My mom was very shocked, so she had my hearing tested multiple times at different places, and I think she eventually came to terms with it.
보청기를 빼면 약간 고요한.
When I take out my hearing aids, it's like I'm in a silent, underwater world.
바닥 속에 있는 기분이에요.
And tell me how it works, because obviously, I mean, singing is challenging enough for those of us who are lucky not to have hearing impairments. But how does it work for them? How do they sing together? How do they sing in harmony?
When it comes to dancing, they use a lot of AI devices. Actually, they perceive sound differently. For instance, they use large displays showing numbers to indicate speeds, and they also use wristwatch like metronomes that vibrate to keep them in rhythm. However, they don't wear these watches during their actual performances because they've practiced enough to remember all the beats and rhythms. Hyunjin told me that they use the wristwatch like metronomes.
네, 여기 지금 보시는 이제 스마트워치.
The smartwatch you see here is vibrational. The rhythm of the song is transmitted individually to each of us, making it easier for us to perceive the beat, even while dancing.
정확히 맞추기가 어렵다 보니까 보컬.
Since it's hard for me to hit the exact pitch, there's a device that shows the pitch. I sing while looking at that screen, and we also use AI to correct the deficiencies.
When we think about K-pop, I guess we often think about these sort of people's idea of perfect young pop stars, perfect young idols, and to have people with disabilities is something a little bit new, a little bit different. Tell me how they have been received by the Korean public.
Yeah, this market is very competitive, and many idol groups debut each year, but only a few survive. But the response has been enthusiastic. Many Korean media outlets have introduced their debut a lot, and the response has been overwhelmingly positive.
And that was Hyo Jung Kim, our reporter from BBC Korean, telling me about the phenomenon that is Big Ocean. You're listening to NewsHour.
Distribution of the BBC NewsHour in the U.S. is supported by UKG. UKG provides the HR, pay, time, and culture solutions to help create a great place to work, and a great place to work can help business thrive. UKG, our purpose is people. And BetterHelp, committed to helping clients with issues ranging from relationship challenges and goal setting to grief and depression. Learn more at betterhelp.com/public.
On the next Brian Lehrer Show, we'll continue to cover the hotly contested Jamal Bowman-George Latimer Democratic primary in Westchester and the Bronx. We had County Executive Latimer on the show last week. This time, Congressman Bowman will answer my questions and yours. As with Latimer, questions will be on both the Middle East and domestic issues, too. The Brian Lehrer Show, weekdays at 10 a.m. on WNYC.
WNYC is supported by The Town Hall, presenting 8th Blackbird. Nico Muley and the Blackbird Creative Lab perform works by Meredith Monk, Nico Muley, and Steve Reich, including the premiere of Two Pianos, July 17th at 8 p.m. Tickets at thetownhall.org.
If you believe democracy requires a free press, your station is WNYC, 93.9 FM and AM 820, NPR News and the New York Conversation.
It's the BBC NewsHour on WNYC. 73 with clouds at 9:31. Here are the headlines. The U.S. Surgeon General has called on Congress to require warning labels on social media platforms, similar to those now mandatory on cigarette boxes. In an opinion piece for today's New York Times, Dr. Vivek Murthy said that social media is a contributing factor in the mental health crisis among young people. Murthy said that the use of just a warning label would not make social media safe for young people, but would be part of the steps needed. Transit advocates are pushing back against Governor Kathy Hochul's move to pause congestion pricing, which she says would be too expensive for hard-working New Yorkers. The governor says charging drivers a $15 toll daytime to enter Manhattan below 60th Street would lead to inflation. She argues the fee would cause the cost of pizza to even rise. A new memo from the group Riders Alliance argues that gridlock traffic already has a negative impact on the economy. Here's spokesperson Danny Pearlstein.
$20 billion a year is wasted to congestion. Over $1 billion of that is diesel fuel. So by keeping New York congested, it's the governor who's raising the cost of our pizza. And congestion pricing will actually stabilize or bring it down, and it'll get it to us more quickly.
The memo says lost time from congestion and gridlock costs the average New York commuter $750 a year. The air quality is good right now, but expected to go up to moderate levels due to ozone pollution. There are very high levels of tree pollen. Now that forecast, 73 with clouds right now, mostly sunny and 85 today. And then we begin tomorrow with temperatures in the 90s. It's going to feel like it's triple digits in this area starting later on Thursday and Friday. Not just New York, but New Jersey as well. Extreme heat, we'll need to take some precautions.
Welcome back to NewsHour. They're big, they're stinky, and they are massive business. Durian, famous as the world's smelliest fruit, has long been popular in Southeast Asia, but the taste for it is increasingly sweeping China. Last year alone, the trade for the fruit in China was getting on for $7 billion, a 12-fold increase from 2017. And that's, of course, as the demand is being driven up, so is the price. Colin Bannell is managing director of My Exotic Fruit, based here in the United Kingdom. Colin, welcome to NewsHour. I know you've been buying durians for years. Presumably you've seen that big price increase as well.
Certainly, Tim, yeah. From when we launched our business a decade ago, we've looked at really a tripling in the price, actually. So there's still an appetite for it, but the price has gone up threefold.
Gosh. And is there still demand, given that increase in price?
Yes, most certainly, more than ever, to be honest. It's particularly special and very notorious, so people are still intrigued and want to buy even at that price point.
Yeah. So here's a confession. I've never had a durian. I'm not sure I've ever actually smelt a durian, because it is one of those things that you would probably remember. What is it about the fruit?
Well, it sparks curiosity. The shape, the smell, the texture. It's debatably very delicious and debatably smells fantastic. It's a bit of a love or hate, it's a Marmite kind of fruit. But people can certainly get hooked on it, and we have people buying 10 or 20 boxes at a time.
Gosh. And yours, I mean, I know there are a great number of varieties. How much do yours potentially retail for?
The absolute entry level, really, these days, you're looking to pay about £60 for one fruit, and then a top variety, and there's many to choose from. You're looking at £100 plus. That's for a whole fruit, but they're very popular sold frozen as well. Right,
and £100 is getting on for $120 or so. So you said debatably smells a bit off. Debatably tastes good. I mean, where are you in the debate?
I
Be
am
honest.
a fan. I wasn't. I wasn't to begin with. It's rich, it's intense, it takes some time to get used to it, and certainly in my first try I wasn't convinced, but I am now convinced. There's many to choose from, and you can get some good ones and some bad ones in my opinion. Some have a very pungent, onion, cheesy smell, but others are absolutely fantastic, just sweet, just a sweet aroma. So if you pick the right ones, they're very delicious, and I'm a fan, but they're rich, so you don't go eating too much in one go, in my opinion.
Oh, I understand. So it's an acquired taste, and I suppose a bit like sort of truffles, the truffle to the mushroom. I mean, you don't need to have a huge amount in order to get quite a lot of kick out of it.
Certainly, I would say the same. I mean, in fact, you can just eat a couple of tablespoons worth, and that would satisfy some people. So you certainly don't need much. And actually, it is kind of perceived in the same way. It's very specialist. It's grown in very particular ways. Different fruits have different characteristics, different textures, different smells, different tastes, different colours, different shapes, different sizes. So I think very much I would categorise it the same as truffles, and also I look at it in the same way I look at wine. It's a specialist fruit.
Understood. Colin Bannell, lovely to have you on the programme. Thank you very much for joining us. This is NewsHour. It's live from the BBC World Service in London with me, Tim Franks, and we've got the shocking findings of a BBC investigation to bring you now. The Greek Coast Guard has caused the death of dozens of migrants in the Mediterranean over a 3-year period, witnesses say, including 9 people who were deliberately thrown into the water. More than 40 people are alleged to have died as a result of being forced out of Greek territorial waters or taken back out to sea after reaching Greek islands. That's according to BBC analysis. The BBC's population correspondent Stephanie Haggerty has more.
The soldiers, they are searching for us. Do you hear how they are shouting? They are shooting. They're shooting live ammunition.
These are audio recordings of the moment Ibrahim's boat reached the Greek island of Samos after crossing from Turkey. He's now a refugee.
There were 2 policemen dressed in black and 3 others in civilian clothes. They were masked.
Ibrahim says he was beaten and strip-searched and that the Greek Coast Guard took him and 2 other men out to sea.
They started with the Cameroonian. They threw him in the water. The Ivorian said, "Save me. I don't want to die. Save me." An incredible strength animated me. I survived.
He swam to safety, but the other 2 men died. We've heard allegations of a total of 5 separate incidents in which people were thrown into the sea by the Greek Coast Guard. In all, 9 of them died. In a statement, the Greek Coast Guard strongly rejected all accusations of illegal activities and questioned the veracity of the testimonies we've gathered. But last year, another incident was caught on camera by activist Fayed Mullah. It showed men in masks forcing 12 people, including women and young children, onto a Greek Coast Guard vessel. They're then set adrift in a motorless raft, abandoned just outside Greek waters. They were found later by a Turkish patrol boat, and an official investigation by Greece is ongoing. The Greek authorities didn't agree to be interviewed for this report, but we showed this video to a former head of special operations at the Greek Coast Guard, Dimitris Baltakos.
I can see people getting on board the vessel. It doesn't seem like it's forceful.
Can you see any small children?
Yes, now I can. That's something that happens. The migrants traveling the Aegean Sea, very often they abandon the children. They don't seem to have the same affection that we have for children.
Do you have any questions about that video?
I don't.
A few moments later, he spoke to someone who was off camera, in Greek. His mic was still recording.
I haven't told them much. What do you think? Yes, it's crystal clear. But what should I tell them? When you look at it from the outside, it's very clear, isn't it? It's not nuclear physics. I don't know why they did it in broad daylight. It's clearly illegal. Obviously illegal. It's an international crime.
In a statement, the Greek Coast Guard said they worked tirelessly with the utmost professionalism, a strong sense of responsibility, and respect for human life and fundamental rights.
Stephanie Haggerty reporting. The interviews in that report come from a longer documentary film which is showing on BBC TV tonight, and there are plans for it to be screened more widely internationally as well. The director of that documentary is Ben Steele.
Now, we're almost hardwired to trust
the Coast Guard. We see them often as the heroes of the sea, people who in your hour of need you desperately want to encounter. And we started examining the last 3 years and what they've been doing. And we've uncovered more than 40 credible, serious allegations that people seeking safety in Europe have died after a direct interaction with the Greek Coast Guard, including 9 people. And the allegation is that 9 people were thrown to their deaths overboard and drowned.
I mean, obviously, you've put these allegations to the Greek Coast Guard. Are they saying they're looking into them, or are they just flatly denying?
So the Greek Coast Guard have a clear track record of issuing non-denial denials. So when facts or allegations with concrete details are put to them, instead of saying, this is not true, this did not happen, their tendency is to say, the Greek Coast Guard behave in an honourable fashion, they are professional, they do everything they can to help people at sea. They don't actually engage with the substance of the allegation that's put before them.
What do you think the next steps are in that case? I mean, you have come up with these extremely serious allegations and what seems like a welter of evidence. Is there any suggestion that this is going to be pursued internationally? I mean, is this something that the European Union are going to get involved with?
So the largest agency in the EU is an agency called Frontex, and it has almost £1 billion of funding annually. They have acknowledged that they were financing the boat that I've just described. So the Hellenic Coast Guard boat that with masked operatives on it, who were taking the women, the young children, and at least 2 small babies on board and then dumping them at sea, abandoning them on a motorless inflatable raft. They were paying the salaries of the operatives that day. They were covering the cost of the fuel. They've acknowledged this. They've had no response from the Greek authorities. I actually, in the film that we made, went and spoke with the head of fundamental rights for the agency Frontex and pressed him on this. He didn't want to engage in the details, but when I asked a general question, which was, is it acceptable to abandon babies at sea? His response was that it would be very, very problematic and that he thought that that would be absolutely the wrong thing to do. But then he then gave an extraordinary caveat, which is he then said, having stated that it would be inhuman and degrading treatment and also risking the right to life, he then stated it would be dependent on the circumstances, the distance from the shore and the way the water would be on that day. Quite an extraordinary statement coming from the head of fundamental rights at the EU's largest agency.
Ben Steele, director of Dead Calm, Killing in the Med. What's going on in Israel when it comes to the war in Gaza and the possibility of all-out war with Lebanon? Today, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced he was scrapping his small inner war cabinet following the resignation last week of 2 of its members. There's also the arrival of a senior US envoy in country to try to ward off a descent into full-scale war on Israel's northern border, and the Israeli military's self-declared tactical pause along a strip of road in southern Gaza to allow more aid in, and the political row that has caused. Which is where I began, with Yaakov Katz from the Jerusalem-based Jewish People Policy Institute.
Well, the army is doing what it can to improve the flow of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip and into different places there. So they've announced a daily pause in fighting along what you could call like one of the key South Gaza roads, which is just basically meant to increase the flow of aid. But it's not a pause in fighting. The fighting continues in places that the IDF is still operating, which is primarily at the high intensity level in the southern town of Rafah.
Right. I am right in saying that it has caused huge ructions inside Israel, hasn't it?
The tactical pause is a perfect example or illustration of how the politics are also getting involved here. Netanyahu and the IDF want to try to increase the flow of aid because they understand, and I speak to American officials, and I hear this from them as well, that for America to be able to continue to help Israel, Israel has to help America and the rest of the world, for that matter, look like they are doing a lot to get the aid into Gaza to the places that it needs to get to. Now, there's a whole question of whether it's really getting to the people or it's being seized by terrorist elements from Hamas, a separate issue. But the more right-wing elements of Netanyahu's coalition, they see a temporary pause and they say, what's going on? We need to keep going full throttle ahead to take down and defeat Hamas. So this creates a lot of ruptures, you could call it almost, in the coalition, where then Netanyahu has to walk back the tactical pause to basically appease the more right-wing elements in his coalition who are now making threats about the future of his government over a 12-hour pause in fighting on one road in Gaza.
We have this news today that the Prime Minister has decided that his small war cabinet he's going to scrap after the resignation last week of Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot. What do you read into that?
Once Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot left the government, as they did just over a week ago, the war cabinet then basically remained Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, the defense minister Yoav Gallant, who's also from his party, as well as two observers, Ron Dermer, the strategic affairs minister, who's also from the same party as the prime minister, and the leader of one of the ultra-Orthodox parties of Shas, Aryeh Deri. Those were observers. The only two members with voting is Netanyahu and his defense minister from the same party. So what was the purpose in still having this war cabinet? The problem became that the more right-wing elements of the coalition, particularly Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, both demanded to join the war cabinet. So Netanyahu, to avoid having to create a war cabinet with his most radical and extreme elements in his government, basically just dissolved the war cabinet. And now what will happen is the decisions will be made solely by the security cabinet, which is the wider, larger cabinet that actually has the legal standing to make decisions.
Tell me about the other big potential development, that is the possibility of Israel's northern border with Lebanon. There's been conflict going on there for a long time with Hezbollah, the Islamist militia in southern Lebanon, but the fears that it could become an all-out war. And this very senior US envoy, Amos Hochstein, is in country today to try and see a way in which the tensions can be diffused. What are the hopes around that?
The situation there is not good, and I think we have to be honest. We've been seeing an increase in Hezbollah attacks and assaults against Israel, hundreds of rockets almost every day now. They are growing in not just quantity, but also to different places that in the past have not been attacked inside Israel by Hezbollah. Israel has been obviously responding, and what happens in this case is while both sides claim they want to avoid a wider war, one miscalculation could lead us exactly there, especially when we're talking about kinetic strikes on both sides. They're bombing Israel, Israel's bombing them. So what you have here is a debate within Israel and a serious dilemma of what's the right move.
And that was Yaakov Katz from the Jewish People Policy Institute in Jerusalem. This is NewsHour.
Distribution of the BBC NewsHour in the U.S. is supported by Viking, dedicated to bringing travelers closer to the destination. Viking offers a small ship experience with no children and no casinos. Discover more at Viking.com. And Progressive Insurance. Progressive is currently looking for individuals in a variety of career fields who are interested in building a career and joining an inclusive and unique culture. More information, including application, at Progressive.com/careers.
Inflation is dropping, but high interest rates still have a lot of us feeling the squeeze on our wallets. Next time on 1A, we look at how the state of the economy might influence the vote in November. We'll also unpack Project 2025, the plan for a Christian nationalist government if Donald Trump is reelected. What issues will matter most at the polls? That's next time on 1A.
Weekdays at 3 on 93.9 FM, AM 820, or live stream it at WNYC.org.
WNYC supporters include the New Jersey Performing Arts Center presenting a conversation with Stephen Colbert and Paul Giamatti on Friday, July 26. Tickets on sale now at njpac.org.
Sponsoring WNYC means reaching thousands of engaged and discerning listeners who've made our shows part of their daily routine. Find more on sharing your business message with WNYC's unique audience at wnyc.org/sponsorship.
Up next, it's the Brian Layer Show on WNYC. Congressmember Jamal Bowman makes his case for re-election to New York's 16th District in Westchester in the Bronx. It's home to one of the most watched Democratic primary races in the country. Plus, City Controller Brad Lander discusses his plans for a lawsuit over the congestion pricing pause. Those conversations and more at 10. 74 and partly sunny now, sunshine today in mid-80s, but here comes the heat. 90 tomorrow, 91 on Wednesday.
This is NewsHour, live from the BBC with me, Tim Franks. Now, given that you're still listening to us, thank you. And we do not take your company for granted. We never have. But especially in the light of a global study out today, which suggests that more of us around the world are turning away from the news. Almost 40% of the people questioned saying they sometimes or often actively avoided news. The research was carried out across 47 countries by Oxford University's Reuters Institute. Nick Newman is a senior researcher there.
These are sort of international trends. We see them in most, not all countries, but most countries. And I think what's driving it is two things, really. So one is just the fact that the news agenda is pretty negative. I mean, we've all lived through a COVID crisis, the cost of living, wars raging in Ukraine and Gaza. So it's these things, these intractable things you can't do anything about on the one hand. You know, people talk about, one respondent, for example, said, world news is too depressing at the moment. It's having a negative effect on my mental health. So that's one thing. And I think the second thing is just the abundance of news, the always-on nature of it. We are bombarded in social media, through news alerts. And I think that's also having an effect. It's the sense that you sort of can't get away, and that abundance sort of reduces the value in some sense for some people.
Right, and I guess that second thing must be in a way, the thing that has changed, because people have always talked about why can't you do more good news stories, and news tends to be, by its nature, I mean, journalists tend to congregate on stories that are to do with how things are going wrong, where they're going wrong, why they're going wrong. I mean, that's just the nature of news. But do you think it's the proliferation that is moving the dial?
I think so. As you say, it's actually quite a sensible reaction to a negative news agenda, and I'm sure it's happened many times in the past, to protect yourself and to try and restrict the amount or the time so you can get on with the rest of your life. But I think some of this other stuff where you literally can't get away from it, it is everywhere, that is much more tricky, and that's causing some people to change their habits or to turn off completely.
You mentioned that this is a phenomenon that is seen internationally, and this is a very, very broad survey of lots of people in lots of countries. Are there particular demographics that are deciding to reduce or turn away entirely from their consumption of news?
That's really interesting. I mean, broadly, women are more likely to avoid the news or say they avoid the news, and also people who are less interested in news from low income groups, for example. But young people is quite interesting because we often think about young people not consuming news, but they do consume news and they aren't turning away more often, but they are using news in very different ways. So maybe they're turning away from conventional news, but maybe not from sort of broader news around passions or things that they care about more deeply. And that may not be the same as the news that our generation thinks that young people should get.
Yeah. Interesting your use of the adjective conventional news there. And I mean, I guess in all these things, we, the conventional journalists, need to reflect on the sort of job that we're doing and how we impart. There clearly is a value to journalism. It's how we communicate it, in what context, and the ways in which we are trying to present what we're doing. Are there... I realise this probably wasn't part of your survey, but are there lessons you think that we could draw from this?
Absolutely. I think, in terms of how publishers are thinking about responding to news avoidance, it's multiple things, as we've discussed. So it's not one thing. So sometimes it's just about making the news simpler. It's having a fewer assumptions when you tell stories, for example. And there's been a whole trend around trying to explain the news better. And that really resonates with young people and old people. But I think also just sort of giving hope. In previous times, within a linear program, a radio or television program, you could provide light and shade. But if you're in a social media feed, it's sort of relentlessly one negative thing after another. So we have to think about how we can give people hope, how we can provide more of that light and shade. Because the news is not universally bleak. There are positive stories, constructive ways of covering the news. And I think that's the other thing to investigate.
Nick Newman from the Oxford University Reuters Institute. It's half-time in a rather significant match in the Europe's premier international football tournament. Significant not because of the stage of the competition, which has only just got going, or because the teams involved are really expected to be potential champions, but because one of the countries is in a unique position. The game is Romania against Ukraine, and it is Ukraine's first match in a major competition since Russia's full-scale invasion 2.5 years ago. It's currently, I'm afraid to say, for all our Ukrainian fans, 1-0 to the Romanians. But let's speak now to Volodymyr Zverov, a Ukrainian journalist and football commentator. And Volodymyr, I mean, let's get it out of the way, but a slightly disappointing start to your championship.
Hello, hi to everyone. Yeah, the start is disappointing, not because just of result, but of course because of the level of play and the halftime. Now is break and is a very disappointing game from the Ukraine. But talking about the last games of Ukraine, I mean, how they played official games before this Euro, they always, Ukrainian national team always conceded the goal first and then making the comebacks. And so we're waiting for another comeback, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, listen, sport is important in lots of countries. To a country that is at war, that sees so much terrible news the whole time, how important are these championships, do you think, in Ukraine?
For me personally, this European Championship, the first is not a question about the result on the pitch, but the result of how Ukraine can talk with Europe again and showing what's happening with our country through the football, through the voices of our media persons. Andriy Shevchenko, the president of Ukrainian Association, also players. So for me, the question of result is the second question in this European Championship. But this, for me personally, a lot of fans waiting for the good result, a lot of soldiers, the big fans of football, they always send in the shout-outs to the football players, and the links with the players and the soldiers is very, very strong.
Is there concern in the country? I mean, given your problems with reliable energy supplies, because the Russians have been targeting particularly the electricity infrastructure, are people worried that they may not actually be able to watch the game live, because who knows if the energy supply is going to be reliable?
So we don't know. Usually we have like the schedule of the light, in the houses, in our homes, and of course people trying to watch the football. Maybe they are going to some cafe or some places where they gonna find some internet, because everyone wanna watch the Ukrainian Championship. But of course the question of light turning off is important here. But this is not the first month for Ukraine. These things, so we know how to do this.
Yeah, you'll get around it. Listen, Volodymyr, good luck for the second half. I hope that the news turns around for you. Volodymyr Zverov, watching the Romania-Ukraine game at the Euros and joining us live from Kiev and bringing this edition of NewsHour to a close.
This is WNYC. FM, HD, and AM New York.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. Later this hour, Congressman Jamal Bowman defending his seat in the hotly contested Democratic primary in southern Westchester and the northern Bronx. We had his challenger, Westchester County Executive George Latimer, last week. As many of you know, today it's Congressman Bowman's turn. That's coming up. But we start with New York City Comptroller Brad Lander, here largely in support of the congestion pricing plan. Yes, we're still obsessing on congestion pricing for driving into Manhattan below 60th Street that Governor Hochul, as you know, has put on an indefinite pause just ahead of its June 30th scheduled start date. Why, Brad Lander? Why still congestion pricing? Because the comptroller at last word was considering legal action to get congestion pricing back on track. We'll talk about other things, too. including the report in Politico this morning that Lander is close to deciding whether to primary Mayor Adams next year. And we'll read some of your responses to the question in our Brian Lehrer Show newsletter last week, asking, if you drive into Manhattan, why do you? Controller Lander, always good to have you. Welcome back to WNYC.
Great to be with you this morning, Brian. Thank you.
Are you going to court for congestion pricing?
Very likely, yes. Look, Governor Hochul took a disastrously wrong turn when she halted the implementation of congestion pricing, leaves a $15 billion hole in the MTA's capital program. We can't modernize our decades-old signal technology. We can't install the elevators. We've been waiting decades to make the system accessible. That's a legal obligation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Congestion pricing is the law of New York State. Governor Hochul does not have the unilateral authority to cancel it. We actually saw that on Friday when the federal government sent their final approval. So we've assembled this broad coalition of legal experts and plaintiffs who have been harmed by this decision, and we are preparing to help take their cases to court.
And as often happens when we just say the words congestion pricing, our lines are exploding. So I want to make sure that everybody has the phone number, pro, con, mixed, just questions, other topics for Brad Lander. They are welcome to 212-433-WNYC. 212-433-9692. Call or text, as some of you already are. You said plaintiffs who are being harmed by the delay in congestion pricing. Who are some of those plaintiffs, and how are they being harmed?
So it's a real mix. Number one for me are New Yorkers with disabilities. It's been a 4-decade struggle to get a real commitment from the MTA to make almost all, 95% of the 472 subway stations accessible. It's still planned to take another 30 years. If we delay congestion pricing, it won't happen. Those are folks, 20% estimated of our neighbors who really can't use the subway system, and they're relying on those resources. But it's residents of the Central Business District who are impacted by the emissions, businesses in the Central Business District that are impacted by congestion. One of my favorites here, I think a potential claim comes from some MTA board members. They voted on a capital plan counting on congestion pricing revenues, and they have a reasonable expectation that the state will comply with their responsibilities under the law.
Why haven't you filed yet? And I guess you're not looking for an immediate injunction against the governor, so the toll can go into effect on June 30th as planned?
So the actions that need to take place that haven't yet happened are still coming. The State Transportation Commissioner needs to sign the final tolling agreement. That was always going to happen in the coming days. The MTA board is anticipated to vote on June 26th. So it'll be helpful to have more clear information about what is and is not happening in the coming days. There's an argument that simply by her statement, the governor has violated the 2019 law, but there'll be a clearer and better case as we see what happens over the next few days.
Which means this is not happening on June 30th, right?
Unfortunately, the governor's action is going to be an indefinite pause. It's not going to happen on June 30th. I mean, hope springs eternal. I still hope she'll change her mind. There's still time now. We've already spent $500 million on the infrastructure. The cameras are up. It's ready to go. But I suspect it will be delayed at least some. Hopefully our lawsuits and public pressure and clarity that we need those resources, and the heat we're going to have this week with bad air quality days and the clarity we need, the emissions reductions, will turn things around very soon.
So I mentioned in the intro that we launched a Brian Lehrer Show newsletter last week. And listeners, if you want to sign up for it, it'll come to your inbox every Thursday. Go to wnyc.org/BL newsletter, wnyc.org/BL newsletter. And it's always going to include, besides some comments from me and other things about the show, a reader question. And our question this week, in edition number 1, because this is what so many people are talking about right now, it said 90% of commuters to Manhattan for work already take mass transit. That's if they're coming in for their jobs. So if you drive in ever for any reason, why do you? And Controller, I want to read to you, as I read to our listeners, some of the responses that we got, all of which I would say lean critical of the idea of congestion pricing.
Sure.
So Jacqueline in Rockland County says she drives in sometimes. She writes, to see artistic performances. Suburban individuals with little public transportation should not have to subsidize New York City subway users. Timon in Manhattan, I think he lives in Manhattan, but outside the zone, convenience plus I'm partly disabled. Congestion pricing is a good idea, but they should have started it with a much lower price like $3.50. Then it could have been ratcheted up over time. Judy in Brooklyn writes, she often drives in. She writes, I am over 80 and cannot use the subways. Driving is less expensive than taking cabs. Fiona in Brooklyn drives in often, she writes, and writes, I work freelance in the film business and only drive in when I have to bring my equipment. Jean in Stamford says drives in sometimes and writes, I have to go to a doctor for examination each 6 months near New York Presbyterian Hospital. Before COVID, I took the train, but it was kind of difficult to get up to the doctor's office from Grand Central. And one more, there we got so many, but these are just the ones that I'm going to read. Martin in Manhattan drives in sometimes and writes, I live here and visit grandchildren regularly out of New York City. I find it absurd. I have to pay to come home from a visit to my family. So there's a sampling of people who wrote that they drive into Manhattan sometimes, often, however much, and a sampling of the reasons. And you had mentioned it's good for the disability community to have congestion pricing so we can build more elevators. That first response, or one of them said, convenience plus I'm partly disabled. So in that person's case, to take the car. So what do you say to that group of responders as a block?
Well, first I'll say I really hear you. Those are important voices. Thanks for sending them the newsletter. And I get that it's hard to envision a city with fully accessible mass transit, with better transit that people feel comfortable and safe and accessible taking. There's no substitute for getting New York City there, and we can't do that without the resources to invest. I really think when we have a 95% accessible system, so many people will be able to use it, and this is the resource we have to do that. Now, most of the people on that list that I heard say I come in frequently are more business-related users, like that freelancer. For those folks, the reduction in congestion and in traffic, I think will actually be a great boon for their businesses. People will be able to make more deliveries and get more business if the traffic isn't moving at 6 or 8 miles an hour. So my hope is that folks that are coming in for work and who may do it on a more frequent basis will see the benefits of reduced congestion, and that the folks who are coming in once or twice or 3 times a year will benefit over time as those trips become more possible via mass transit and as the city has the economic health that comes from better mass transit as well. Look, no one wants to pay for the things we all need, but we're not able to fund our mass transit system just on the fares alone. Those resources have to come from somewhere, and funding them while reducing traffic and emissions is a way cities around the world have done it. There's always those feelings like you just read right before it goes into effect. But in the places around the world, they've implemented it where it works. Congestion comes down, transit gets better, and people's anger diminishes over time as they see the real results.
And listeners, I'll just say as an aside that that's our first example of bringing some of your responses to the question in our newsletter onto the show. We will continue to do that on a regular basis. And again, if you want to sign up for the newsletter, which is going to go out to people's inboxes every Thursday, you can do so. It's free, obviously, wnyc.org/BL newsletter, wnyc.org/BL newsletter. Listener writes just now, Controller, in a text message, Why has the MTA put such weight on congestion pricing for its budget? What were other funding options for accessibility upgrades to the subway?
It's a great question. Unfortunately, what the MTA has done in the past is borrowed a lot of money without clear revenues to fund it and then gotten in real trouble. That's why the MTA was facing a fiscal crisis, and it could be again. Unfortunately, no one has put on the table a really good, solid, fair revenue source otherwise. The one that the governor proposed, a payroll tax, really hits the economy and hits workers, and I don't believe is a good idea at this moment. I'm open, maybe you can use the newsletter next week. And if people have creative ideas, of course, we'll consider them. I will say in addition to this $15 billion hole, none of the ideas for funding would reduce congestion, reduce traffic, reduce emissions. We're about to have a heat wave this week with poor air quality. And this, in addition, is one of the steps we can take to reduce emissions and to reduce traffic congestion, which will reduce crashes and make our streets safer. I'd like to see us use some of the street space it'll free up in Manhattan to try new things like micromobility lanes to get the mopeds and the e-bikes in dedicated lanes and enforce that they have to be there rather than on the sidewalks. So there's real opportunities here. That said, we're all ears if people have other ideas. We just have not seen a real plan B.
I think a lot of people listening right now, because we get so many calls also on the dangers of the mopeds and the e-bikes going every which way on the sidewalks and the streets, wrong way on one-way streets in ways that cars would never do or hardly ever do. So how would those micro-mobility lanes work? I can just hear the voices of drivers in my head saying, wait, we already have fewer driving lanes on many city streets because of the bike lanes. Are we now going to have a sidewalk, a bike lane, a micro-mobility lane, and then something for cars?
Well, look, we've got so many more e-bikes and mopeds than we did a couple of years ago, and we just have not evolved our rules, our enforcement, or our infrastructure to catch up. And that's why they're running like haywire. This really is a management challenge. Unfortunately, the city has not stepped up. The mayor and city DOT haven't stepped up to say, let's have a real and comprehensive plan. Congestion pricing, where it has been implemented, results in, and we project here, about a 20% drop in traffic in Lower Manhattan. And that is streetscapes that you can use for things to pilot micromobility lanes. That's got to go along with enforcement because people have to then stay in those lanes. And that means making sure people have the licenses if they're a moped or an e-bike that is effectively a moped. That means making sure the businesses that are employing them are held accountable. And that means some real enforcement as well. But infrastructure is part of the solution. And congestion pricing creates one opportunity to try something to get control of what has indeed become chaos that pedestrians and drivers and cyclists all feel.
Marcia in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC with Controller Brad Lander. Hi, Marcia.
Hi, hold on. I'm sorry, I had to take the speaker. Okay. Hi, Brad. I think I'm going to be the one to sue you back.
Uh-oh.
I feel this is the worst implementation of congestion pricing on thoughtful policies of integrating good urban planning that could have made it a success. We have developers on the far east and west side. Where were the agreements made, maybe some rebates for them, for low-cost municipal parking? We have issues with yellow cab drivers who have been on your program, Brian, actually. Mm-hmm. Why didn't we think of utilizing electric yellow cabs, creating plans where they would go to those far east and west side sites, which would then transport us, people like me, who has to go visit my oncologist in the middle of the city, who cannot afford the extra $15 round trip. I mean, and I have so many people in my own community who are working poor, who can't afford it, who must go in and out of the city without any thought of integrating urban planning into this particular plan. I am a former cyclist before my cancers. I walk at least 4 miles a day, and I do take the subways now, particularly that we finally have an elevator at my current subway stop.
Well, is that 7th Ave?
And my last thing for you, Brad, add one last question. Where's the audit of all of the other MTA surcharges that exist that I have not seen transparently published anywhere on your website? Maybe I've missed it, and if I have, please tell us where to find
You mean
them.
like per taxi ride and where that money is being used?
Taxis, gas bill, electric bill, state taxes, city taxes. I'm sorry, I don't have the list in front of me right now.
Marcia, thank you very much.
Marcia, can I ask, is that the 7th Ave 9th Street elevator that we just got installed that you're using?
Right, the lowest section of the F train stop instead of the
Yes.
highest section on the 8th Avenue side. Yeah.
Absolutely. Look, I fought for years as a council member to win that elevator. It took me a decade, unfortunately, and all of us in the community, we even used participatory budgeting to vote some money into that elevator. And I'm so glad it's there, but we can't have that be the process that gets elevators in the rest of our subways that would make it possible for you and for other folks like you. Look, I agree with you. Better urban planning is needed to integrate our transit and transportation goals. I like some of your ideas. I'd love to follow up on them. I understand why folks are frustrated. I want to see us have subway elevators like that at every station. And if we don't move forward here, we're never going to get there. So, look, I hear you. I want folks like you to be able to get smoothly in and out, to see your doctor, again, to do business, to see those great cultural institutions. But if we cancel congestion pricing now, what we're going to wind up with is a subway system with old signals that don't work for people, with very few stations, only 30% now that are accessible, and with a level of traffic that really is a disaster. So better urban planning, 100%. Keep the ideas coming, and let's try to work together to do this in a way that genuinely moves the city forward.
Marcia, thank you for your call. If you do actually countersue him, make sure your lawyer gets in touch. That'll make an interesting segment, too. But I think she was speaking conceptually and rhetorically. I'm just going to mention before we go on to some other topics that there are a lot of people calling in and writing in opposed. There are a lot of people calling in and writing in for congestion pricing as well. I'm acknowledging we took some texts and calls that were more critical because our guest is for, and, this is not a poll. We're trying to have meaningful conversations, so that's why we did what we did in this particular case.
We come on, Brian Lehrer, to hear from people who disagree with us and try to, push the conversation forward. So,
Brad Lander, honorary producer, for getting it about the show. So moving on, you just mentioned cultural institutions, and I think you've been commenting, or your office has been commenting, on the vandalism aimed at the Brooklyn Museum and some of its leaders. Do you want to talk about that?
So terrible. I'm just so sick and angry about this. Yeah, last week, the Brooklyn Museum, its director, the wonderful Ann Pasternak, was a member of the synagogue in my neighborhood, and several board members, their homes were blasted with just hideous graffiti. These anti-Semitic attacks have gone so far. I want to see...
Are they anti-Semitic in your view, as opposed to their vandalism, but policy-oriented against supporting institutions that support the war in Gaza?
These attacks were anti-Semitic. The language at Ann Pasternak's home, I think, unquestionably targeted her as a Jewish New Yorker. Yes, I'll be honest, I don't understand the attacks on the museums as institutions anyway, and how that will make things safer for Palestinians in Gaza. Look, I want to see a ceasefire. I want the hostages to come home. I want a path toward mutual recognition, but none of that comes from putting anti-Semitic graffiti on the homes of the board members and directors of the Brooklyn Museum, which I don't know if you've been there on First Saturday on those evenings, but it's like the most diverse, inclusive, beautiful place for bringing different kinds of people together I'm aware of. That's here nor there for these attacks. But yes, they're way over the line. They absolutely are anti-Semitic, and they got to stop.
And funny enough, the New York Times pointed out that In their words, to those who were targeted, it must have also seemed profoundly confusing. 7 months ago, the museum was criticized not for a sympathetic view toward Israel, but instead for anti-Semitic leanings. The turmoil in which so many universities and cultural institutions were now engulfed was playing out at the museum as whiplash. You agree?
And I've talked to some staff and board members, and they're heartbroken. They're just trying to go to work every day and provide the city with this essential resource. No one deserves this, but they sure don't. And again, these kind of horrible attacks, they don't do anything to advance the cause of peace. They don't do anything to make kids in Gaza safer. They just make us all less safe, and they got to stop.
This actually brings us back to Governor Hochul and the subways in a kind of roundabout way, because she floated the idea last week of reinstituting what I guess there was before COVID. I was never aware of it before COVID, but a mask ban on the subways so that, in this case, people who may be considering illegal acts that they consider pro-Palestinian can't, break the law or commit violence or threaten people while hiding their faces. Do you support that?
I do not support a mask ban on the subways. Look, as you could hear, I feel really passionate about what we have to do to stop the anti-Semitic attacks. I want to see the folks who did it held accountable. But a mask ban on the subway, to me, is just a invitation to civil liberties violations. The main people I remember seeing on the subway with masks before the pandemic were Asian American New Yorkers trying to keep themselves safe in a public health context. COVID rates are rising currently. Air quality is going to be bad this week. Why would you tell people that they can't wear masks on the subway that they might believe they need for their own health? I don't really see how a mask ban on the subway is going to keep people safer. Even in the incident that the governor was referring to, the main person was not wearing a mask. They were easily identifiable. I think it's a mistake from a public health and civil liberties point of view. We do need action on anti-Semitism and hate, but this is not it.
And I'll be transparent about a little self-interest. I generally wear a mask when I'm on the subways because of various risk factors, unless the car is very uncrowded. And I see people continuing to wear masks, on most subway rides that I take. There are a few in each car, as well as it being more common among Asian Americans. And another layer of reason there not to. But do you think that the governor is serious about that? Or why would she even float that while saying people for religious reasons or health reasons? I think those were the two possible exemptions that she cited. How would they even enforce it? Would I need to carry a doctor's note every time I take the one train? You know what I mean?
I know from your doctor or your rabbi. I really don't know. Look, when these things happen, you want to do something and you say, here's something to try. It is hard to root out hate and make people feel safe. But that doesn't justify a policy that could hit you, that could hit, the folks who are immunocompromised. And of course, just folks who are concerned about their health. So yes, let's try something else.
Also, I guess this gets us back to congestion pricing a little bit, but the politics of it. It's been widely analyzed that the governor's main reason was to help Democratic candidates in the suburbs running for Congress. So for you as a progressive, I'm sure you very much want to see Democrats retake control of the Congress. And we saw the backlash in 2022 that put some more Republicans in the Congress from the New York City suburbs. Backlash to, perceptions of crime, I think, at that time were key. Now it's immigration. Now it's congestion pricing. And I wonder what you think of if the governor's reason really was to help protect those Democrats in the suburbs, who mostly are running against congestion pricing themselves or taking that position, that might be, a worthy trade-off to make at this particular time when Donald Trump might wind up president. You don't want him to have a Republican Congress, if that was really the governor's reason.
The most recent swing seat election was Tom Suozzi's win for Congress in Long Island, and he supports and defended his support of congestion pricing. So I really don't even understand the argument. Others, Pat Ryan, who I was thrilled to knock doors for 2 years ago, he doesn't support congestion pricing, and he'll explain that to his constituents and push against it. And that's an area where, I guess Tom and Pat disagree. But they both are great examples of Democrats who win in swing districts because they're clear and honest with their constituents, because it's clear they're going to fight for them. They're going to tell them, what they believe and be honest with them. And that's how I think Democrats will win everywhere, in the suburbs as well. That's part of why I think the flip-flopping by the governor here hurts Democrats. We got to be clear what we think, put something out there, talk honestly to people when they disagree with you, make some room for, Pat Ryan to think one thing and Tom Suozzi to think the other. But I think the flip-flopping will actually hurt us much more. It's also the case that where congestion pricing has gone into effect, that opposition diminishes as people see its benefits and understand that they're not that likely to feel its harms. And if it had gone into effect on June 30th, by November, I think we really would have been in a different place. If we're still fighting about it then, it's going to be a more salient issue. So even on the politics, I think this was a mistake.
Terrence in Canarsie on something completely different. Terrence, you're on WNYC with Comptroller Brad Lander.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we got you.
Hi, Terrence.
Yeah, Mr. Comptroller, thanks for your financial stewardship, and you've been my hero since you led the effort to reduce plastic bag usage several years ago in the city. But I want to ask, this is Pride Month. I want to ask a question about the Pride March. I mean, I'm not a member of the gay community, but I think this is a fabulous event. And I saw you and numerous elected officials participating last year and expect you will do so again this year. But in my view, this event has really been tainted the last few years by the decision to ban gay and lesbian police officers from participating. I mean, they participated for many years prior to 2021, and one can go back and look at the photos of onlookers cheering them on along the parade route. I believe their organization is called the Gay Officers Action League. So you seem like the kind of leader who abhors discrimination and bigotry. So will you be my hero once again and call for the immediate reinstatement of LGBTQ police officers seeking to get back into the Pride March?
So the ban, just to understand it, the ban is because the NYPD as an institution is seen as anti-gay and otherwise repressive, and therefore gay police officers, gay and lesbian LGBTQ police officers as a group were barred from the march. Is that the...
Well, I mean, I guess we'd have to ask the organizers what their rationale is. I mean, in my view, they were catching a lot of flack several years ago for two things: taking so much money from corporations and also having police officers in the march. So in my view, they decided to throw the police officers under the bus, and they're still taking tons of corporate money.
Got it. Controller Lander.
Thank you, Terrence. It's a good question. Look, Pride started, at the Stonewall Inn in reaction against what was then 50 years ago police action. That said, it's my understanding that it's about on-duty officers carrying guns, and that maybe there's a way to make room for LGBTQ police officers, which we're so lucky and grateful to have, to participate in the march in a way that doesn't, is not a police action, but that is a signal of who they are. So I'll follow up and talk to folks, and Brian, I'll report back to you.
Okay, we just have a few minutes left. Excuse me, as I swallow water into my lungs instead of down into my stomach. Sorry, folks. Did you see the Politico New York playbook this morning? Their newsletter that goes out to so many people. Top story: Brad Lander seriously considering primarying Mayor Adams next year. May announce next month. Can you confirm?
Look, it's something I'm thinking really seriously about. I love this city. I love serving the people of this city. And as I talk to them, they're anxious about the city's future and about its leadership. I was out across the boroughs all weekend, and I kept talking to people who were saying, on the weekends, we want to see the public libraries open and the illegal weed shops closed. that's about providing the management and leadership the city needs. I have not made any decisions, and I'll be happy to come back on and talk to you more about it when I have.
It does look like you're trying to get a charter revision proposal, and this may sound like democracy wonk weeds to a lot of people, but there's this whole back and forth between the mayor and city council now. Council passed this bill that would give themselves the power to approve or deny more mayoral appointees. The mayor apparently is impaneling a charter revision commission, which also has to do with who has what power, and you're jumping into that fray. Can you explain that whole scene as you see it?
I will do my best. Look, there is good reason to doubt Mayor Adams' motives for appointing this charter revision commission. It does seem to be in this kind of tiff with the city council. They proposed legislation that would require a charter amendment, and he's trying to quash that with a hastily impaneled charter revision commission. That said, there's no doubt that we could use better management and especially better fiscal stewardship. So I came forward to the Charter Revision Commission with 5 really constructive proposals that would improve the way the city's run, make sure we've got adequate money in our rainy day fund for when we hit a recession, that we actually know how much we need to invest in our infrastructure, that we pay our vendors on time, that we keep our debt under control. So we presented those to the commission last week. They are independent, and if they want to show that they're doing their duty, I hope that they'll put some of these proposals on the ballot. Citizens Budget Commission backs 3 of the 5 proposals we've made. They're very constructive and hopefully could get us beyond this political back and forth to really focusing on what will make the city run better for the long term.
So if either yours or the mayor's proposals are on the ballot, that's another set of things that we would certainly cover on this show that New York City voters would have to get their minds around, in addition to everything else that they'll have to vote on this November, correct?
That's right. It'll be the same ballot in November that you're voting for president. We'll have proposals this commission would put on the ballot to change the charter. So, yes, we'll need to have more conversations in advance of that.
30 seconds. Describe your favorite charter revision proposal of your own out of your 5.
Well, number 1 really is making sure that we've got enough money in the rainy day fund for when we hit a recession, so we don't have to lay off teachers or, underfund our parks. The voters voted in 2019 to create the rainy day fund, but there's no rules for putting or keeping money in it. So it's just the vicissitudes of the council and mayoral negotiations. We've got a great proposal for annual deposits, so it builds up over time. You got some money in your savings, and when you hit a hard time, you could keep your city going strong.
New York City Comptroller Brad Lander, and who knows, by next month he may be New York City Comptroller and mayoral hopeful. Brad Lander, thanks for coming on as always.
Great to talk with you. Thanks so much, Brian.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Congressman Bowman for a candidate interview next. Stay with us.
We're so grateful that you welcome WNYC into your home. But that doesn't mean we have to stay there. WNYC goes wherever you go with the enhanced WNYC app. Listen to WNYC Radio live in the park. Hear a podcast on the subway. Read Gothamist at the coffee shop. Get the full WNYC experience to go. Download or upgrade to the new WNYC app now at wnyc.org/app.
WNYC supporters include the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, working to build democracy and racial justice from the ground up in New Jersey and beyond. Learn about the Institute's Juneteenth reparations event at njreparationscouncil.org.
The Met, now on view, a new exhibition tells the story of the creative visionary who shaped Tiffany & Co. Museum admission is pay what you wish for New Yorkers. Learn more at metmuseum.org. Leadership funding for WNYC's local and digital news initiatives is provided by the Jerome L. Green Foundation, a proud supporter of New York City's major cultural institutions.
On tomorrow's Brian Lehrer Show, it'll be a very busy day for us. We're going to be hosting a roundtable conversation on AI in medicine, including how artificial intelligence is interacting with you and your healthcare, including its role in diagnosing diseases, creating medications, patient billing, and also bias in the algorithms. Plus, your questions and mine for Senator Kirsten Gillibrand in her monthly appearance tomorrow. And it's Tuesday, so we'll have our climate story of the week. All of that coming up on tomorrow's Brian Lehrer Show.
This is WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820, NPR News and the New York Conversation.
WNYC. Now we turn again to the hotly contested Democratic congressional primary in parts of the northern Bronx, including Wakefield and Co-op City, and much of southern Westchester. Last week we had the challenger, the Westchester County Executive, George Latimer, and now the incumbent, two-term Congressman Jamal Bowman. As we mentioned last week, the Israel-Hamas war has been a central issue in the race, so we will talk about Congressman Bowman's views on that in some detail, as we did with Executive Latimer, but we will also get to domestic issues like housing, other inequality, inflation, and other things to compare their views on. Congressman, thanks so much for doing this. Welcome back to WNYC.
Of course, Brian. Thank you for having me. Good to be with you.
And listeners, as we did with the Latimer segment last week, we'll take a few phone calls or texts for the candidate. We took some very critical ones for Latimer, and like last week, don't make them only on the Middle East, okay? 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692, call or text. Congressman, I'll follow the same format we had for your opponent. The first stretch will be Middle East related, then we'll turn to domestic issues. With Executive Latimer, we established that he declines to support President Biden in asking Israel to take a step back in the war, as Biden put it, step back. He declined to urge Israel to publicly accept the Biden ceasefire plan, declined to support Senator Schumer in calling for new elections there, and declined to criticize Prime Minister Netanyahu in any way by name. When I asked him if there was any reason to for him, he said he won't criticize any individual in Israeli politics by name. So he is different from President Biden and Senator Schumer in those ways. And the voters will make their judgments about those positions with respect to him. For you, I have a different set of questions, and I'll start here. My first Mideast question is this. You said in the News 12 debate that Hamas has to go. I think you said it in those words. Hamas has to go. But you're calling for a permanent ceasefire, not a temporary one. Permanent ceasefire is a Hamas condition for a ceasefire, precisely so they can continue as a military fighting Israel. So how do you explain what could be seen as a contradiction, saying Hamas has to go, but you're for a permanent ceasefire, which would guarantee that they stay and have continued power?
So when we call for a permanent ceasefire, that includes a release of the hostages. That includes humanitarian aid getting into Gaza as quickly as possible. And that includes all parties coming to the table to build and create a pathway to peace, which hopefully finally gets us to a two-state solution where Palestinians can have freedom and self-determination and where Israelis can have freedom and self-determination. And so Hamas, as currently constructed as a terrorist organization, cannot be a part of that conversation politically. And in terms of strategically and surgically, militarily, that has worked better in our Middle East conflicts than the collective punishment we are seeing right now. And so a pathway to peace has to be diplomatic, has to be political, has to include the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, and other Arab nations who want to be a part of the solution, as well as the U.S., as well as the UK, and obviously as well as Israel. And so, as we know, this issue is incredibly layered and complex, but the powers that be who are involved, like the U.S., Israel, and then formally a power that be the Palestinian Authority, need to be at the table toward a real pathway to peace.
Right, so that's a big picture answer, but you're out there calling for ceasefire now, permanent ceasefire. So I'm going to ask my question again. Doesn't a permanent ceasefire ensure that Hamas remains in power?
No, I don't think so. because I don't think there is a military solution to Hamas, especially the military solution and pathway that we are currently on. I think what we're doing at best is getting rid of everyone in Hamas now, which is not happening. But at worst, with every new child or baby or innocent civilian killed, we are giving birth to the next iteration of Hamas or extremism in the region. So no, I do not think a permanent ceasefire keeps Hamas in power. I think a permanent ceasefire combined with the other things I mentioned towards a pathway to peace is the best way to deal with the issue of extremism that continues to rear its ugly head based on our violent responses.
Is the permanent ceasefire you support conditional on release of all the hostages?
It's all part of it. Permanent ceasefire includes release of all the hostages, humanitarian aid into Gaza, and coming to the table to really honestly have a discussion and then move policy and resources toward a two-state solution. You know, when I went to Israel with J Street a couple of years ago, you know, I had a chance to go into Israel, Tel Aviv, and many areas, but I also had a chance to go into the West Bank. You know, I went to Ramallah, met with Palestinian leaders there, went to Hebron, had a chance to meet with the organization Breaking the Silence, and both Israeli and Palestinian scholars on this issue. And we talked about the challenges as it relates to a two-state solution because of settlement expansion into the West Bank. I believe the number is now 700,000 over the last several years. And as we know, J Street is really pushing for a two-state solution and to do something about the settler violence there. And so when I talk about a pathway to peace, it has to include a Palestinian state. And I think politically and diplomatically, that's how we end the extremism that's in the region.
But when you mention J Street, and for people who don't know, J Street is I don't want to mischaracterize it, a progressive pro-Israel lobby. They very much contrast themselves with AIPAC, the more right-wing pro-Israel lobby that's supporting your opponent with a lot of money. But I read the other day that even J Street has withdrawn its support of you because they see you as too anti-Israel. Respond to J Street, assuming I saw that correctly.
Yeah, I don't know if their reason for doing that was because I was anti-Israel, because I am not anti-Israel. I support Israel's right to exist as long as it is following international law. You know, it's been a difficult time since October 7th. For everyone, but particularly for the people in the Jewish community, within the Jewish community, within the diversity of the Jewish community. And so J Street, unfortunately, was under a lot of pressure.